My name is Eric Braxton. I'm the executive director of the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organizing. We'd love to start by having people introduce themselves in the chat feature. We see that some of you have started to do that already. So please just go ahead and tell us your name, your organization, where you're from, and a movement or a leader that inspires you. So you can use that for in the chat feature. Uh, Let me just say a little bit about this webinar series. So this webinar is part of FCYO's Youth Core project. The Youth Core is a set of activities that's designed to create regular learning opportunity for youth organizing groups from across the country to come together, learn from each other, share resources, and build shared strategy. We believe that building relationships and learning from each other are the basis for a more connected and more powerful social justice movement. So Youth Corps does this through a national convening, which we'll now be doing every 2 years through these regular webinars and other kinds of learning activities and exchanges that we plan to be supporting in the next year. Uh, just a technical note about this webinar, you all participants will be on mute, but it really encourage you to use the chat feature to ask questions and engage with each other. So let me say a little bit about this webinar. Um, we're really excited to be doing a discussion around momentum-based organizing. We know that lots of organizers focus on building organizations that can mobilize a set group and win victories. And then at the same time, in the last year, we've seen these movement moments that have sparked mass protest and engaged huge numbers of people. So what's the relationship between organizations, campaigns, and mass movements? And how can organizations be ready to organize mass actions if our cities become the next Ferguson or Baltimore? So the folks at the INE Institute have been thinking about these questions and training organizers from across the country. And so we're really excited to have some of them here to lead this webinar. So let me introduce the two folks that are going to be speaking on this webinar. First, Maria Fernanda Cabello is an undocumented immigrant from Mexico. She's been an organizer in the Immigrant Rights movement since 2009. She started organizing in Texas, where she fought to keep in-state tuition for undocumented students and continued her organizing work in the campaigns for DACA and DAPA. She also directed the I'm a Dream Voter project, and she's currently a volunteer organizer with Cosecha, a new nonviolent popular movement aimed at winning permanent protection and dignity and respect for all immigrants. Second, James Hayes is an organizer from Columbus, Ohio. James started organizing after taking part in mass mobilizations with the Occupy movement and to protest the murder of Trayvon Martin. In 2012, he helped to found the Ohio Student Association and spent 4 years leading campaigns to end the criminalization of young people of color. So these campaigns helped to stop the Stand Your Ground laws from entering Ohio and stop corporate control and takeover of the Columbus schools. James is now the training director for the INE Institute, and INE serves as an ecosystem of social change through INE serves the ecosystem of social change through research, training, and supporting communities of practice that bring more balance to the world. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to James and Maria Fernanda, and they will lead us in this webinar.
Thank you, Eric, so much, and thank you, everyone, for hopping on this webinar with us. We are really excited to be having this space and bringing this material to y'all. It's going to be a little different for me. It's my first webinar. I'm used to being in a room with folks. It's going to be a little different, not feeling your energy, but hopefully we can get you all to a training in the near future, and y'all will be excited by this stuff. So before we begin, I just want to tell y'all a little, kind of story about me and about who I am and how it is I have sort of come into working with INE and Momentum. Like Eric said, I'm an organizer from Columbus, Ohio. I still live in Columbus now. And for the last 4 years, I've been organizing with a group called the Ohio Student Association I helped to found. And well, I guess the one picture went away. This is a picture from an action that we did with the Freedom Side. I was there. Mafe was there as well, representing United We Dream. Um, and This was in July of 2014. And young people of color from around the country mobilized through the Freedom Side Network and had come to Nashville, Tennessee for a meeting of the National Governors Association. And we organized this. We had young people from multiple states coming to talk to their governors about the crisis of the criminalization of young people of color. We were coming to talk about police brutality, about mass incarceration, about deportations, and about the school to prison pipeline. And this is a picture from that action where we had hundreds of people there. It was a beautiful, powerful action, but we were unable to meet with our governors that day. I was arrested in that action, as were a couple other folks from Ohio, and this one guy from the Dream Defenders in Florida. Um, and and we had a powerful action. We felt like we'd done something, but it was clear that we hadn't made the impact that we wanted to, and we went back to our homes to continue organizing. And then something happened just a few weeks later. Like I said, this was July 2014, and just a few weeks later, Eric Garner is murdered in New York, and video of his murder goes viral. And then very shortly after that, John Crawford III is murdered in Beaver Creek, Ohio, in a Walmart about an hour from where I live. And then a few days after that, Mike Brown is killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And the people of Ferguson uh, really move into action and launch a new type of energy, a new type of moment, a moment that I've come to understand as a moment of the whirlwind. And we'll get into that a little bit later in this training. Um, and while the people of Ferguson were escalating things in their own local struggle, that was also launching energy across the country. And we began escalating things in Ohio as well around the murder of John Crawford III. Um, this is a picture from an action that we organized where we brought couple hundred people to Xenia, Ohio, which is a small town in sort of the most backwards county in the state. Is Xenia is where the courthouse where the grand jury was meeting was, and we organized a march from that Walmart where John Crawford was killed to go to that courthouse, and hundreds of people were coming out to our actions by this time. This was not the first action we planned. There have been dozens of actions at this time. People were coming out, and the typical rules that I had learned in organizing, where you have to call somebody 3 to 5 times to get them to turn out, multiply your maybes by zero, divide your yeses in half, the organizer math that we've been taught. That stuff did not apply in this moment. A Facebook page was bringing people out to actions without any turnout calls being made. And there was so much happening, not just in Ohio, but all across the country, obviously, in this time. There was a real, mass popular movement happening. And one thing that's interesting that I've always thought was interesting about the time is that in those elections, the 2014 midterm elections, there was the lowest voter turnout since World War II. And you know how we always hear that people don't vote because they're apathetic. This popular movement was showing that people aren't apathetic, and that there was a real desire for change, and people were willing to put their bodies and their lives on the line for it. Um, and later that in December, after the decision in Ferguson came down not to indict Darren Wilson, after the decision to come down not to indict uh, the officer who killed Eric Garner, and there were tens of thousands of people in the streets. There was a meeting, a serious meeting, called by with some of the leaders from Ferguson. I was invited as well to represent what was happening in Ohio. Some people from New York and Florida as well. Um, and it struck me that in July, just a few months earlier, we were unable to meet with the governor. We were arrested trying to meet with the governor. And now, a few months later, we were being invited to meet with the president. And I couldn't quite put my finger on what the difference was. All I knew was that by this time I was exhausted. I was dead tired because of all the work that we had done. But then I came to a momentum training early in January 2015, just maybe a month after this meeting, and I began to get language for the things that we've been doing, the theories that we've been enacting that we understood, but we hadn't systematized that knowledge, and this was providing a framework that was helping me think about what my organization had been doing, what I'd seen the broader movement doing, and how we could integrate some of the lessons from the traditions of organizing that we have in the U.S. to make a real difference in the world. And so that's how we come to momentum. Um, and so before we get into the sessions that we want to kind of just give you, obviously the whole momentum training is like a 3.5 day thing. You know, so we're only going to get into a little bit today. Hopefully it whets your appetite, gets you excited to come to one of the trainings that we have later that will be scheduled for later this year. And I just kind of want to lay out a little bit about what momentum is. Momentum, you know, aims to give activists the support and tools they need to launch popular movements. Um, and we do this through the trainings, obviously, where we bring people together, leaders from different organizations, leaders from different popular movements, people who are trying to launch popular movements like Cosecha, or another movement like If Not Now, that's been launched recently. Um, we do this through coaching organizations and movements that are trying to innovate and integrate this information and this theory into practice. This is really at the beginning stages of a lot of this, and we really understand that there has to be a relationship between theory and practice. And so we hope to support people through coaching that are trying to put this stuff into practice. That's what Aini and the Momentum Core team will be doing more of this year. And that community of practice is how we hope to help people support each other as well, similar to what y'all are doing right now in Youth Corps, by creating a space for people to support each other and share learnings and best practices. Right now, we have a national community of practice where people who've been through the trainings and are trying to innovate and experiment with different things or can communicate. And we're beginning to also experiment with local communities of practice where people can begin to build deeper relationships on how to support each other and integrate this stuff. Um, we already did the introductions, and so before we go too far, I just want to stop on this slide for a second, because a lot of the stuff that we're going to do, I remember when I first came to the training, there were some things that it really resonated with me on an instinctual level, and there were some things that went against a lot of things that I've been trained on. Some things that I was like, I'm not sure exactly. I'm not sure if if I can if I can bring this into my practice right away. And really, what we want to make sure that we lay out that that's not our intention. Certainly not with this webinar. It's not even our intention in the full trainings to have people leave fully endorsing this material and fully trying to transform their whole organizing philosophy and models. But really, what we want to do is begin to develop an understanding of this material, understanding of the traditions of organizing that we all come from. We all come from different lineages and different traditions, and understand those and appreciate them, appreciate the differences that exist between them, the strengths and the weaknesses that each have, what different traditions can offer to one another. And then after that, if it's something that you really like, we're going to move people into the phase of experimenting so we can see what works, what doesn't work. And then some folks are fully endorsing and practice in launching popular movements with fully decentralized models and doing and really sort of innovating and experimenting. And we'll see, and you can learn more about that from listening to Mafe talk about Cosecha maybe some other time. We're all super excited for what they're doing. So with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Mafe to introduce herself and get us into some of the different traditions of organizing that we come from.
Great. Thank you, James. So again, my name is Maria Fernanda. You can call me Mafe if you're in a rush. But I'll talk a little bit about myself in a bit. But I'm part of the Momentum core team, so we've have over a year and a half that we've been putting these trainings together, and I'm really excited to be able to show you a little bit about one of the modules that we do on the first day, which gives a little bit of the background of where Momentum comes from, which is the difference between, not the difference, but just we want to acknowledge the two traditions that we come from, which are what we call structure and mass protest. And the reason we're going to go into it is because there's a great quote by Marshall um, McLuhan. I want to say that's the right way of saying it. And it says, "We don't know who discovered water, but we know it wasn't the fish." So sometimes we've been doing organizing for so long that we become embedded in a culture and we forget the assumptions that this culture makes. And all of our organizing comes from assumptions and comes from traditions that sometimes because it's been carried for so long, or we've been doing the work for so long, or because we do the work with people that believe in the same tradition, we forget about those assumptions. So we're going to take a couple of minutes to separate those two traditions and talk about them so that we can dissect it. Um, that you might see certain aspects in your work. We're not saying that you're embedded into a box, but we just want to dissect the two structures of tradition that we see, the two structures of organizing that we see. Um, and yeah, so there are two dominant traditions of organizing, or as we teach in Momentum. And the first one that we're going to go through is the structured tradition. And that's actually the tradition of organizing that I come from. And this is me in college. That's why I'm wearing a suit. I don't really wear suits anymore. But I'm undocumented. I came from Mexico when I was 12 years old. And I'm still undocumented. And when I went to college, I had heard, if y'all have heard about this thing called the Dream Act, it would have been a bill that allows college students, undocumented students that went to college, to be able to get citizenship and actually start using the career that you studied and paid for. But when I got into college, I got a Facebook message from the local Dream Act group, and they were saying that the local student body was trying to pass a bill to get rid of in-state tuition. They were saying that my education wasn't worth it, that I was wasting taxpayers' money, that I was taking away the spot of a deserving citizen. And we, thankfully, there were other dreamers. I wish I could tell you that my first instinct was to organize and to jump on the front lines, and it wasn't. I was scared and I felt very rejected, and I was wondering if what they were saying was right. But there were other dreamers in the school that actually organized an event. They wanted for students to show up in solidarity against this bill, because we believed, I went to Texas A&M, which is a very conservative school in Texas, which is why this happened. But we wanted to show that we didn't agree with that. And so I showed up to this meeting, and there were around 60 other undocumented and allies folks in the room. And we actually got the student senators to not vote on the bill because they got so scared of everybody that showed up. But this was right before winter break, so that meant that they were still going to take the student bill afterwards. And I remember going back home and I was thinking, like, there has to be a way that we can stop this bill. And I stumbled into this book called Rules for Radicals. If folks have read it, and if you haven't, I definitely suggest it, which is written by Saul Alinsky, which is one of the people credited as the father of structure organizing. And there's a lot more people involved in this that will go through it. But I started reading about the importance of like building your organizers, about the importance of like targeting the decision maker and focusing on them. And I remember going back to school and we're like, we have to read this book. And we started targeting the student body president because we knew that we weren't going to be able to move all the student senators, but we thought maybe the student body president will veto it. So we started doing these online petitions calling him like, he's anti-education, he's anti-students finishing their degree. And he just, eventually he called us into his office and he said, can you just please stop? What do you want from me? So we told him, we want you to veto this bill, which is what he did. And so this was my introduction to structure organizing within the student movement. And I eventually joined United We Dream Network, which I left around a year ago. But I wanted to dig deep with y'all about, because I didn't know any of the traditions. I had read this book and I started using it, but I didn't understand all of the assumptions and everything that came with it. So if you're wondering, if you haven't heard about these things before, maybe you're wondering, like, am I part of structured tradition? Are my friends part of structured tradition? So structured tradition comes from, if you've heard of organizations like the IAF, which is the Industrial Areas Foundation, which is one of the organizations that sprouted from Alinsky. NOI, the New Organizing Institute, which is now under Wellstone Action. They follow the structured tradition. If you organize or know people that organize with the Pico National Network, maybe I usually would see you nodding or shaking your head, so bear with me. Also, the Midwest Academy, which was founded by Heather Booth. If you've gone to their trainings, they're pretty amazing. And I would just say the reason Midwest Academy was founded was because there wasn't a lot of room for women leadership in IAF. So Heather Booth was one of the people that pioneered a space to allow women to continue in the structured tradition. And I saw a couple of you putting Ella Baker as like somebody that you look up to. And Ella Baker was big, big, big in the structured tradition. And one of the things that she really believed in was leadership development. And this is one of the characteristics of structured tradition. If you've ever done a one-on-one or have had a one-on-one done on you, which is usually like a 45 to 1 hour meeting where you try to understand where you're coming from, and you're either trying to get somebody to join your campaign or they were trying to get you to join their campaign. Because the worth of an organizer in the structured tradition is depending on your network. How many people can you turn out? And which goes into the deep leadership development. I think this is a cool characteristic of the structured tradition, that you can actually trace back your lineage. You probably have Paul Engler, if you've read his book, "Tis an Uprising," makes a joke that it's like a Jedi and the Padawan. Like, they give you all the knowledge and you take it from them, and then you give that knowledge to the next person. So you can trace back the masters of your, maybe that's the wrong word, just the teachers of your teachers of your teachers, because that's how important it is to pass all of your knowledge to one specific person. Another big characteristic of structured tradition is that you fight for winnable issues that the community cares about. One word that we use is like stoplight organizing, which means that the wins are very concrete. When structured tradition started in places like SNCC and in Chicago, it was all about, the streets keep flooding every time it rains. Like, we need to do something about it. Or they're not picking up the trash in our communities, or like this specific center doesn't allow us to go in. So it's like very local, concrete campaigns that people know that can be won. So, for example, I don't know if you've ever heard of check cart neutrality. So the unions all come from structure based. And something that they fight for is to ensure that the workers can unionize without being scared by their boss. It's called check cart neutrality. It might not sound really exciting, but it's a big deal for the unions. And that's usually the very like concrete local campaigns that they work on. Another example, if you've heard of 287G, if you've been around the Immigrant Rights movement, in summary, it allows the police to work directly with ICE, check cart neutrality. And sorry, I just saw a question that somebody typed. It's called check cart neutrality. 287G, which allows cops, let's say you're undocumented and somebody is like beating you up and you call the police. That means they would ask you for your ID. If you don't have one, they're forced to tell ICE that you're undocumented. And this thing is called 287G. And a lot of groups, especially in the South, are always fighting specifically to get rid of 287G. So that's another example of campaigns that come from the structured tradition. Another characteristic, it's large targeted actions. If you've ever gone to like City Hall or a representative's office with a lot of people, or maybe to a town hall, that also comes from structured tradition. Alinsky has a cool quote that says, like, you pick the target, you freeze it, you analyze it, you personalize it, and you polarize it. You figure out who's the decision maker or who has the power to give you what you want, and you focus on them a lot. And when I used to work in United We Dream, our person to polarize was Representative Boehner, who refused to put the immigration reform bill on the floor. And we focused on him so much that we went outside his house in DC the morning of the week before Thanksgiving at like 4 in the morning. This was around sunrise, this picture. And we set up a Thanksgiving table with empty chairs to remind him of the families that would be separated this holiday season because of his inability to pass immigration reform. Um, so if you've ever done some sort of like crazy, or you've seen people that like really focus on somebody, that probably comes from structured tradition. Uh, if you've heard from Arpaio in Arizona, terrible sheriff that does really mean things to undocumented immigrants. In a very big summary, they had this. They always have campaigns trying to the Adios Arpaio campaign to get rid of him. So they're all very polarizing against Arpaio. Um, James, I don't see your camera anymore. Cool. So now let's dig into the second tradition, which is mass protest. And James is going to run y'all through it.
Thanks, Martha, so much. Yeah, so the structure-based tradition is is one of the dominant traditions we've identified, and the other is um, the mass protest tradition. And within each of these, there's sub-traditions and disagreements and different, you know, understandings and interpretations of within each tradition, but we sort of have been able to sort of systematize them as these two big camps. Um, and you know, just like the structured tradition has its list of teachers and leaders and thinkers who've been innovating and developing some of this stuff over the last you know century. The mass protest tradition does as well. Here's some folks like Lisa Fithian and um, George Lakey and the mass protest tradition focuses much less on targeted actions that target a decision maker, and more on mass scale actions. How do we get massive mobilizations? This is a picture from the 2006 marches for immigrant rights, which I think still to this date are the largest mobilizations in U.S. history. Um, and up to this point, uh, you know, in the immigrant, and I, I don't come from the immigrant rights struggle, so a lot of this knowledge comes from my relationship with folks like Mafe. But in 2006, there was this terrible bill, the Sensenbrenner bill, that was Sensenbrenner, right? Yes, that was introduced. That these marches were coming in reaction to, but they weren't just people weren't just going to Sensenbrenner's house. They weren't just going to DC. These were happening in every city across the country, where there were thousands and millions of people in the streets, taking off of work, shutting down shutting down their cities, and people had not seen something like that, in the recent time in that movement. Um, as well as mass scale actions, the mass protest tradition also focuses a lot on mass arrest and escalating nonviolent action. Not always arrest, but always escalation, and always continuing to escalate. And with these actions and with these escalation, creating a disruption that dramatizes an issue and creates a moral crisis that changes the weather around the entire issue, rather than focusing on a particular policy demand or victory. Um, oh, good second. The point of these is to create this moral crisis around an issue that opens up the window to win so many policies that weren't on the table before. And I can think in my own experience, organizing in Ohio around the criminalization of young people of color before before August 2014 and after August 2014 is a completely different place, and the conversation is different. The things that we can talk about that people consider legitimate are different, and there's been real policy wins, even though a lot of the actions that were happening didn't necessarily have specific instrumental demands they were making. And this escalation, what it can do, what it can lead to, is what we call moments of the whirlwind, where there's multiple mass actions happening in such a way that it's continuing to create a sense of escalation. I mean, in these moments, it's like what I talked about in my story earlier, where the rules of organizing that we learn in the structured tradition go out the window. And this term "moments of the whirlwind" actually comes from a conversation, um, a conversation that Saul Alinsky had with one of his mentors, Nicholas Van Hoffman, who was organizing in Chicago in the early '60s while the Freedom Rides were happening. Um, and some of the folks in his organization wanted to host an event in support of the Freedom Rides and have some of the Freedom Riders come. And and Van Hoffman thought that this was too early in the organization's development to make this the campaign, that they hadn't done enough of the groundwork in the community yet. They hadn't built enough relationships with leaders and done the one-to-ones that they needed to get the turnout for the type of meeting. This would be their first big meeting, and he wanted to make sure that it would, just like we all would if we're when we're launching an organization, that we launch the right way. And so he was skeptical because they hadn't done the work around civil rights before. They hadn't built that the relationships with those types of leaders. And on the day of this, on the day of the meeting, about an hour before the meeting starts, he's sitting in the gymnasium alone, and he's worried that that his fears are warranted. And then an elderly couple comes in, and some more people come in, and not long after, the gymnasium was full, and people were continuing to come, and they had to wait outside. They had to get loudspeakers so that people could listen to the meeting from outside of the gymnasium. And when he called Alinsky later that night to talk to his mentor, Alinsky said, "It sounds like you're in a moment of the whirlwind, and all the normal rules, you're going to have to kind of throw them out the window in this one, and figure out how to move forward in a whole new context." And that's what can happen when we escalate. We can create this moral crisis that creates that where we continue to escalate, and it creates moments of the whirlwind. Here's a picture from the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, um, which had one of the largest mobilizations in the history of the civil rights movement. Something that people don't know a lot is that it wasn't the first March on Washington. There was a previous March on Washington, um, I think maybe 3 to 5 years earlier, that attracted tens of thousands of people. But it was but it didn't attract the hundreds of thousands that the March on Washington did. And this, obviously, in between there was a whole sit-in movement led by the young people of SNCC, led by folks that people like Ella Baker had been training, but who were engaged in sort of nonviolent escalation in a decentralized mass movement, that became organized into SNCC. Here's a picture from the 2003-2006 anti-war movement, which were some of the largest mobilizations in the U.S. history. Actually, my first huge action was during this time. I convinced my mom to take me. I thought I would miss school, but it was on a Saturday, so I didn't get to miss school. But I did get to march with over 300,000 people, and it really opened my mind to what was possible. Here are those 2006 immigrant rights marches. This is Occupy, which uh, uh, was a time where I was radicalized in the fall of 2011, and we saw people across the world begin to take action. And I remember, coming out of that, and something we get into in the full training is this conversation around framing the movement victoriously. There was a conversation on when did Occupy fail? And one thing that is clear is that today the conversation on income inequality is completely different than it was before Occupy. And a candidate like Bernie Sanders, who's openly calls himself a socialist, is a legitimate contender in the Democratic primary. And obviously, right now we're in the middle of another popular movement that's emerged out of Ferguson, the Black Lives Matter movement, and swept across the country, that I've been involved in, and has mobilized and radicalize tens of thousands of people, new activists that are getting involved, that are mobilized outside of structure. And that's one of the other sort of big differences between these two things, is where are we getting people for these actions? This action that we see right here is a picture from from a march that happened right after the decision to not indict officer, I can't remember his name right now, the officer that killed Eric Garner. And a couple young women made a Facebook page, um, and over 50,000 people showed up the next day. They didn't do any one-to-ones to make that happen. They just took leadership in the moment and were able to provide that space for people to take action. And they weren't doing it through their organization. They didn't have a list they were going through. They're doing this outside of the structure, targeting the public, targeting the masses of people, and people are turning out. And so, and one thing that we want to make sure we talk about is we're not the first people to identify some of these differences, some of these traditions. We're trying to systematize some of this in language that we can be useful for us today. Here's an example of some other folks that have noticed these two sort of differences of approach. Charles Payne writes a lot about the civil rights movement. This book I've got, The Light of Freedom, is a must read about movement, the movement in Mississippi. He talks about the community organizing tradition, the community mobilizing tradition. Francis Fox Piven talks about the difference between membership organizations and disruptive protest movements. Ivan Marovic, who was a leader in the Otpor movement in Serbia, where a lot of the inspiration for this stuff comes from, talked about organization and protest. Alinsky talked about organization and movement. Dr. King talked about the long-term units of power that we need to build and the dramatic crisis that we need to create. And in his organization, we see, actually, let me get to that next. I think we'll do this. The next slide is about the spectrum, because while we're presenting these things as different, as sort of two different things, it's not a polarity, and it's really a spectrum, and different folks integrate in different ways, and there's been in the past different integration, different examples of that, where people like the Industrial Areas Foundation, IAF, which is Saul Alinsky's organization, are very heavily on the structure side, and folks from the Clamshell Alliance, which George Lakey was a key in organizing, are very heavy on the mass protest side, and the more decentralized organizational model side. But there's been clear examples of integration. Gandhi was really a master at integrating the ability to escalate, escalation and sacrifice, but turning that back into organization and structure. And we see here like Ella Baker was it was more sort of on the structure side. King was more on the mass protest side. Something that a lot of folks don't know is that Ella Baker ran Martin Luther King's organization for a long time, and was never really given the credit she deserves because of the legacy of sexism in the civil rights movement. But while they worked together, we saw a good integration of those two approaches, where we see, a theory around creating dramatic crisis, creating escalation, creating moments in the whirlwind, but also having the leadership development and the structure to sustain that and keep it going forward and reproduce it. And so I just want to kind of pause here for a moment. Now that we've gone through the two sort of dominant traditions as we have, as we've laid them out there, I think there might even be some other questions. I know that Will and Eric were going to help us sort of facilitate some of that. But I also want to just sort of just stop and ask you all to reflect for a minute, maybe not 5 minutes in pairs, because we can't do pairs, but maybe just like 2 minutes, just to sort of think about, like, have you ever been part of a mass protest movement, a structure-based organization? Like, what was your experience? Like, what were some of the things, just like in maybe a sentence, a couple sentences, and maybe y'all can help us pull out maybe some questions, Will and Eric, or some or some things that should be shared.
Great. Yeah, you have a question here. It says, where would programs that are under the restrictions of nonprofit politics fall under this?
That's a great question. Yeah, no, there's definitely uh, an important conversation to be had about how we integrate this stuff into the organizations that we currently work in. Um, there are different people, there are different, like in my organization, we've always sort of operated with a bit of an integration. I think in nonprofits, I think we can get to a deeper conversation about that. Towards the end of this, we actually have a slide that talks about the difference between driving popular movements and also supporting popular movements. And sometimes, nonprofits are in a better position to support some of the stuff rather than always drive. But each organization needs to make a decision about how much they want to integrate, how much they want to innovate, and sort of what they want to do with that. I don't know if I do.
Yeah, I think we're talking about traditions of organizing. I think some, I can't categorize all of them, but some like political nonprofits don't do organizing. Like maybe they're more like DC or policy based. So then they wouldn't really fall under the spectrum if they're not doing organizing. But then if you do policy and organizing, um, nonprofits are also all over the spectrum. Like I worked in United We Dream and we were more on the structure base. And you can see like a couple of groups sprouted from Occupy, so they're a little more mass protest. But this is for organizing traditions, and policy doesn't really fit into that.
So do you want to encourage other folks to put their reflections to this question in the chat?
Yes, please. We would love to hear maybe most folks in the chat if you're from structure or mass protest, maybe somewhere in the middle. And yeah, Nathan, you said it right. It's like nonprofits, it's where they fit. Maybe any questions as you're thinking of your reflections?
And yeah, I mean, if there's
You have a couple of comments coming in now. Nathan says, I've participated in mass protests and worked inside structured organizations for many years. The mass protest work is extremely powerful and can change perceptions and what's possible in a short period of time. Structure groups can build long-term power by creating the ability to work on difficult problems that persist over time.
Yeah, I thank you, Nathan. I think we're about to go into that, but I see you're talking about the strengths from both sides.
Yeah, you're a step ahead of us. And I see some other messages coming in as well. Hey, what's up, Angel? How you doing?
I see somebody asked over here. Oh, ooh, somebody was part of the global justice movement. That's awesome.
Yeah, so Randall says, I was part of the global justice movement in 1999 to 2003 and Immigrant Rights movement in 2006, and had many years in structure-based work.
Okay, I just saw a question. Somebody asked, oh, I lost it. Somebody asked about what's our experience with folks 18 and under in social movements. Is that, oh, here it is. What is your experience organizing young people under the age of 18 to move on political actions? You want to talk about that, James? I think you answered that in Ohio.
Yeah, we've done a good amount of that. At least once a year, we organize some sort of action with youth, usually in partnership with like a Freedom Schools program, and we've also done stuff like when we did the school takeover campaign. Uh, my sister was in high school at the time, and there were some other folks that we knew were that leaders in high school, so we were mobilizing folks, some of the high school leaders. But yeah, I mean, it can be difficult. I think, but it's really rewarding. And young people under the age of 18, a lot of times, um, just like get this stuff so quickly. Like one of my one of our leaders, my coworkers, Awia, her younger sister Fatma is she 10 right now or 11? She might be 11 now. I think she's about to be 11. And we were at an action. This might have been 2 years ago actually, and there was a bunch of people going to the Wendy's headquarters, and in Dublin, Ohio, and everyone was outside the Wendy's, you know, and she was like, "Why don't we go in? They're all inside," you know. So like, she just was automatically got like escalation and confrontate and like the importance of confronting power directly. So a lot of the leaders in my organization are above the age of 18, but I do have some experience organizing folks younger than that.
There's a question here from Heather. It says, what factors help an organization decide to move in a structured versus a mass protest movement for a cause? Pros and cons, in a sense.
Well, I think I mean a lot of it. I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think so often, like when I you know when I started organizing, we were given trainings, you know, that sort of that we already had. You know, like we were fish that didn't know the water, right? Like we were just swimming, and so we were just trying to figure stuff out as we went along, and doing what we saw. And, you know, as I was building the organization I was a part of, and I think a lot of it just comes down to like the role that we want to play. We're about to get into a part that talks about the strengths, and some people already talked about the strengths and the weaknesses potentially of each of the two traditions, the different distinctions between tactics and theory of change and organizational models, and a lot of it comes down to what is your personal preference, what are you comfortable with. You know, in the structured tradition, we've already noticed some folks who said like, you know, that there's more sort of slower paced work, with longer fights, where you might be supporting mass protest work, where you're doing things that are, you know, more high energy. You know, as an organization, as leaders, we have to make sort of decisions about what role we want to play within a movement ecology, which is another part of the training we talk about. I don't know, Mafe, do you have anything to add to that before we go into the distinctions?
Well, I would say you also don't have to, it's not, you don't have to choose between one or the other. It's there, both sides have their strengths and weaknesses. And it's also about capacity. How big does your organization want to grow? Sometimes we found that structured tradition, I, I think I'm going into the weaknesses thing, but structured tradition, because of the invested deep leadership development, it's hard to go to scale. But then, mass protest, when you go to scale, sometimes it's hard to absorb people in, and then like, what do you do? So it's, um, I think it's about what sides of both do you want to take in.
That's great. All right, cool. So yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the distinctions between each. We've already kind of got into that, um, and so I'm wondering if yeah, like so if we could sort of get some folks like what are some of the strengths of the structure tradition? Just real quick, just pop some stuff out. Like what are some of the strengths of the structure tradition?
So I hear Nathan put a weakness, that a weakness of mass protest is that you need to wait for that moment to happen, and it's unpredictable. And then Barbara is saying a strength of structure is funding, clear goal,
Mm-hmm.
sustainability, and deep relationships. Yep.
Yeah, that's all great. Those are all great things. Yeah, passion as well. What might be some of the weaknesses of the structure tradition, or some of the things that we struggle with?
Hard to get to
Hard to get to scale.
scale, slow to react, it's
Hmm.
expensive.
Yes, yes, it is.
We all know RIFA spent $130 million on the immigration reform fight of 2009. Political restrictions.
Hmm. Yeah, that's all. That's all right. Yeah. And quickly, what are some of the strengths of the mass protest tradition? What are some of the things? I see. We
Oh,
get too
another.
comfortable is another weakness. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Accessibility is a strength of the mass protest. Everyone can participate.
collective growth.
Some of the challenge the status quo. Yep. Wider influence. hmm Cultural shift. Yeah. Emotions showing a strength. hmm Influencing large groups of people. Beauty and power. Yeah, that's definitely right. Yeah. What about some of the weaknesses be or some of the yeah self and collective realization is very true. That's very true. Follow ups. Yep. I'll never forget in my first big Occupy action, we had over 1,000 people on a sign up sheet, and we didn't do anything with it. It was terrible. Media, ability to show people what is possible, and huge avenues for people to see themselves in actions. That's one of the strengths. Yeah. Trends and times, consistency is a struggle. The organization side, yeah.
Maintaining
Maintaining momentum.
momentum. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how do we make that sustainable? That's a big family gathering. What do you mean by that?
Infiltration. Yep. That happened in Occupy.
Oh, yeah.
And civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm. Need to be repeated and repeatable, not just one-off actions. Outreach, yeah, ritual practices, yeah, yeah. No, these are all difficult to build strong relationships that are key to resilient networks. Yeah, no, this is all really good. This is all really good. Yeah, so I'll pass it off to you.
Oh, sorry, I missed it. No, we have a couple of minutes left. But yeah, all of you have pointed out, and I saw some of you started talking about what are the actual limitations of nonprofits within the political world. I'm sure we could have a whole session about that. Um, but so what it'll be cool. We usually have butcher papers, we can show it, but I think maybe some of you, and I don't know if I can get some agreement, is that sometimes it seems like some of the weaknesses of structure are the strengths of mass protest, and maybe the strengths of structure are some of the weaknesses of mass protest. Did y'all, does that seem like something that you can agree with? If I can get, Nathan says yes. Okay, cool. So we're not crazy, because that's what momentum is sometimes. Yeah, some of it, it's not because it's a spectrum. Some people take a little bit of both. So, but when we talk about the two dominant traditions, we see that mass protest, it's great at having like large scale actions, but they suck at following up. But then and structure is great at following up, but they have a really hard time about going to scale because you need a lot of money for it. So this is what momentum is. We talked about the integration of structure and mass protest, which sometimes it's hard to do when you've been swimming in your own water because it's hard for you to realize the assumptions that your tradition has. And maybe we just neglect the other side. When we're part of structure and we see Occupy happening, it looks different and it looks scary and it's easy to dismiss it. And then it's easy for folks in mass protest to see the campaigns that are structured are working locally and dismiss them and that they're not enough. So sometimes we're not in good ecology with both of them. And Ivan Marovic, who is one of the leaders of the Serbian Revolution with the movement called Otpor, who now does talks about disintegration across the world, who was a big influence on momentum. What he told Paul Engler, who's one of the people that worked on this, he says, I've been in many countries after the failure of mass protests, and it is in the time with it is in this time when they have the revelation that they need both protest and organization. So when I'm in the immigrant rights movement, we fought for DAPA, the expansion of a work permit for the parents of dreamers and U.S. citizens and residents. When Obama did the announcement of 2014, on November 20th, 2014, he gave the expansion to stop the deportations of parents of U.S. citizens or residents. He didn't do that for parents of dreamers. So because me and my brother are both undocumented, my parents continued to be under the threat of deportation, even after working for 6 years in all of those campaigns. And I'm sure some of you can relate to working for many years in either one of these traditions and still, like if you were part of Occupy, like if you felt that you could win and then it wasn't there anymore. So what we're noticing is that after you go through this failure or you see the limitations is that you get the revelation that we need a hybrid, that we can't continue to stay in our own water because we need to be able to mix what's good from structure and mass protest. Um, but it's also not new. It's new in the United States, or at least in the last couple of years, because the civil rights movement was really good at this. But we see other movements across the world have done this hybrid. Gandhi had a really good integration, the Salt March and all of those peak moments of the whirlwind. But he also had like this deep communities that would live together and organize together so that there was a system for absorption when India was trying to get away from their colonization from Britain. So if you've, sorry, I don't want to assume everybody's on the same page. With the Salt March, it's people in India had to pay a tax to Britain to consume tax, even though they could create it, they could make it in their own country. So, one of the big icon actions you can think of is when they marched to the sea and they picked up salt. Otpor, which is, we just talked about with Ivan Marovic, in Serbia, they got rid of their dictator through a front-loaded decentralized strategy, which we talked more about in our other modules. But it was student leaders that had failed in mass protest or had seen the limitations of mass protest and seen the limitations of structure. And together they were able to create a structure that wasn't it wasn't like a hierarchical structure where anybody could join, but it allowed them to create this big moments of the whirlwind up until the general strike where they shut down the capital until Milosevic stepped off his seat. United Farm Workers, Cesar Chavez also had a really good integration. Cesar Chavez comes from the Saul Alinsky lineage. His mentor was Fred Ross, whose mentor was Saul Alinsky. But he also learned a lot from Gandhi. And he realized that, and he had they had like this intentional communities where if you wanted to become part of the movement, you would get paid like $5 a week. And going to these houses and become an organizer, but through this mass mobilizations of the greats, the anti-apartheid movement was also really good at this. They had this big moments of the whirlwind, but the African National Congress was a big avenue to absorb a lot of these people until they were able to not only allow Black Native folks to vote, but electing Nelson Mandela. And we talked a lot about the civil rights movement. I would really recommend reading This Is an Uprising from Paul Engler, and he opens up his book talking about when they were, if you've seen the movie Selma, there's a time when John Lewis and like some people from the SCLC are like arguing about turning people out to vote versus like big moments. So that's the tension civil rights movement had, but overall they had a good ecology around it. So that's what momentum is. We believe that we can integrate both the structure and mass protest. And by putting both of this together, we can actually drive movements that can help us win the big changes that we need in this country. There's three movements that are sprouting right now around immigrants' rights, around Palestine occupation, and around politics and government. If you've heard of Democracy Spring, that is happening in April. So we're trying to reintroduce it into the United States. And I know this is not a lot, but we have, like James said, 3 days of modules where we go into how do you actually build this hybrid? And how do you create those moments of the whirlwinds and how do you absorb from them? But James, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I just wanted to show them the cycle of momentum, just real briefly. This is sort of a snapshot of what you will get in the rest of the training, where we go over how do we actually start to build um, the ability to win active popular support around our issues by escalating and absorbing people back into our organizations. And just wanted to show you, give you a little teaser, and see, hopefully see y'all at a future momentum training. And then also I wanted to show y'all this slide as well, which we would get to in a deeper way as well in the additional, in the longer training. But just it's something that the Momentum Core team has developed recently, about making a distinction between what does it mean to drive a popular movement, what does it mean to support a popular movement. And so I know for some of you, you're in different positions in what your organizations can do and will do in relationship to popular movements. And so I just wanted to give you guys this slide so you can think a little bit about what sort of role you and your organization want to play in relationship to the popular movements that are that are happening and launching today. So yeah, with that, I don't have anything else. I don't know if there's any questions, Eric or Will, that we should take, or if, I know we're a little over time. So
Yeah, we can hang out. Are you all open to hanging out for a couple of minutes to see if people have questions? If people do have to jump off, I just put a link. I just put a link in for the webinar evaluation. We really want your feedback about what was good about this webinar and what can make it better. So I just put a link in the chat. If you can go there and just give us some feedback both about this webinar and also what topics you'd like to see in the future. We really appreciate your feedback. Um, so I encourage people to do that. And then I also just want to announce that our next webinar will be on March 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern. And the focus on that is going to be lessons from FCYO's Shared Narrative project on how to reach different types of funders. We've been doing a research project on how youth organizing groups can talk to different funders who may not see themselves as youth organizing funders, but what are the ways that youth organizing groups can talk to different funders and reach them. So we'll be sharing the outcomes of that research. That's on March 15th at 2 p.m. Look out, there'll be an email and an announcement coming up for that about that soon. So yeah, I just wanted to announce that next webinar. And then also put the chat link. But if you all are open to sticking around, if people have additional questions, we can continue to take questions as well. Someone asked if you can access the slides. I can tell you that the webinar recording will be posted. FCYO's new website will be launching in the next week or two, and we will have all of the recordings from all of our webinars on the new website. So you will be able to reach the recorded webinars there. I don't know we'll see if we can figure out how to get the slides to folks. Are there other things, James and Maria Fernanda, that you would say for folks that are interested in learning more about this work? Are there other ways? How can people learn more about Momentum?
So we have a whole set of webinars also that have been recorded with a couple of folks talking about all of these modules at a deeper level. I'm typing in the website here for Momentum. Also, what is INI? It's also another website where you can find the resources. What is it? INI.institute. There you go. Thank you. So those are places where you can find more information if you're interested to learning more about. Also, this is Paul Engler, who's one of the people that did a lot of the research for this material. He just wrote a book that we're really excited about. You can also read more about it. Yeah, if you want to try to do more research into this, we try to understand the hybrid.
Great.
And it also just right now, I don't think there is another momentum training currently on the schedule, but there are a number of requests for momentum training. So the core team is going to be meeting soon and getting a lot of dates on the calendars. So that keep your eye out for those, so you can make sure you come to the next one that we have, or if you're even interested in bringing a momentum training to your city, you can reach out, and we can have that conversation as well, about what it looks like to organize a local training. And I also want to extend an invitation for y'all to come to another training that INE offers, which will be the weekend of April 15th and 17th in Boston, called Swarm, which is all about decentralized organizing models, and really how to get to scale through decentralization. And it's something that is somewhat of a companion to Momentum, and is really exciting, fun stuff. Especially if you want to come nerd out for a couple days and think about innovating the organizing models that we have. Please come and hang out. That information will be on the website tomorrow, actually.
Great. Great. Well, thank you so much, James and Maria Fernanda, for sharing all of this with us. We really appreciate this. You shared some of the opportunities for how people can continue to learn more about momentum and how they might be able to apply some of these ideas to their work. We hope this has been valuable to all of the organizers out there. Again, the work that you all youth organizers are doing around the country continues to inspire us, and we hope to continue to offer webinars that will be helpful to you to connect with each other and learn skills and resources. So please do fill out the evaluation and let us know what was useful about this and anything we can do to make it better, and what topics you'd like to see in the future. We really want to have your feedback on all of these things. So again, thank you so much to the speakers for this webinar, and thanks to everybody for being on. And we look forward to connecting soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Keep on fighting. See y'all soon.